can you just give us some insight into, what the general thought has been on? To me, I'd never really seen a great explanation for why the murder rate dipped and stayed low for that time period. There's a lot of politically motivated reasonings out there, obviously, and I haven't seen a great explanation for our current environment either, or why it should go one way or the other. Do you have thoughts on maybe just starting with that crime drop in the 90s and how the country was able to sustain that?
Yeah, I think it's hard to say with certainty. And I think that generally it's complicated is the best answer. I know it's like the least satisfying answer to give in an environment like this. But
well, as long as it's the true answer, that's what we want.
Right. I think anybody selling you it was X or it was Y is sort of selling you a bill of goods and is not being reflective of the complexity of the situation. I think that in the 90s, or the late 90s, early 2000s, strong economic conditions, there was a big surge in policing in the early and mid 90s. The crime bill. I think that there was you sort of saw a leveling off of arrests. They didn't continue to go up nationally, and for a lot of offenses that maybe drove mass incarceration, drove issues like that. It's the level of the crack boom. I don't know exactly how you would describe it, but that era sort of faded and went away. So I think that, and then also the other thing, there's a sociologist at, where is he now? Princeton, maybe? Patrick Sharkey, who talks about this sort of boon in investment in social programs, and that for every million or $2 million or $3 million that were spent on social programs targeting people that were engaged in behaviors that might lead to gun violence, led to a 1 or 2% decline in murder rate in the city. And so you had all of these things, these policing and non-policing elements that sort of came together. And I think that all of them coming together sort of weaves the tale of how murder tended to go down. I don't think that we can necessarily point to exactly what the recipe was, but I think that all of those things make sense as drivers. Very similarly, in 2020, we can kind of point to what a few of the explanations that make the most sense are, and each person is going to be different. And I think the same caveat holds, that anybody telling you that it's X or it's Y is giving way too much confidence to the explanation, because 80% of cities saw an increase. 80% of cities did not see giant increases in protests. 80% of cities did not see waves of police resignations and depolicing. So what the actual explanation was is to explain such a national increase, I think you have to look toward the national trends. And so we know, so we have to sort of go through the chronology of 2020. Murder was up. It was up about 7% through the first quarter, through sort of April, early May. And we can see that from the FBI's supplementary homicide report data. So we know that,
and that's the onset of the pandemic period, right?
That's the onset of the pandemic. So it's
before
not
the riot,
pandemic
before
did
the
not
protests
cause
and
the
riots
surge.
and stuff. Yeah.
Right. It wasn't, the pandemic happened and then murder went up in the US. That clearly did not happen. In May, June, July, August of 2020, there was this big surge in gun violence. It was guns. It was, the number of firearms, or the share of murders that were committed via firearm in 2020 was over 70%. And that was by far the largest percentage ever recorded. That figure has been sort of going up steadily, but it went up a lot in 2020. And using the FBI data, we can see that sort of non-firearm murders were generally steady year on year. Firearm murders went up big. As far as how to explain it, I point to the sort of the depolicing and the loss of police legitimacy, loss of police trust after the murder of George Floyd, all of the protests. I think that those are symptoms of the same disease. If you've have you read Ghetto by Jill Leovy, it's a terrific book. It's all about murder in Los Angeles, but I think it speaks to the importance of what she calls the monopoly of state violence, so that the police are the ones that are the only ones that can make arrests, that can solve murders, that can basically delve out justice for killings that have happened. And in the absence of that, in the absence of trust that the police are going to do that, then you're going to see this sort of cycle of violence that is very difficult to interrupt. So you've got retribution killings, you've got lots of arguments, lots of sort of drug deals gone bad. Everybody's in a sort of a weird place mentally after the pandemic. And so you get this environment where you've also seen this pullback in policing in a lot of places. And it's hard to say causally whether it was this sort of loss of trust or whether it was this sort of loss of policing happening. But they're definitely both happening at the same time. And the question is, are they causally linked, or are police pulling back because the people are protesting? And so these things are just sort of happening at the same time. And then the other factor that I think is important is that, as you've noted, there was this big surge in firearm sales that predated the George Floyd. It started in the early 2020. And so we had this big surge in firearm sales. And what we see in, I did a piece on this with Rob Arthur in, I think, Vox. But if you look at, we took data on arrests and stops in 10 cities that had data. And starting in March, April, the share of stops and arrests where a firearm is found it skyrockets in all of these places. And so the implication here is that either one, police suddenly got really good at figuring out which car had a firearm in it, or two, with the firearm sales, there was a big increase in the share of people that were carrying firearms. And so I think that you could build the argument, not that firearms are a cause here. It's not that, again, we didn't see a surge in firearm sales and then all of a sudden we saw a surge in violence, but that the surge in people carrying firearms meant that a lot of situations that maybe previously would not have had a firearm involved, suddenly this argument has a firearm involved because a lot more people are carrying firearms during the pandemic. So that's my way of conceptually putting it together, but I don't have a lot of data there. I've got a lot of individual pieces that I think make sense to me. I don't know that that's necessarily the answer, though. Right.
And I do think there's a couple of critiques I would have of the last bit, at least, because I do agree with you that there's a lot of probably nuance in what's happening here. And it's not just one factor that played a role in the murder spike, right? It's probably the pandemic. There was also a lot of prisoner releases at the beginning of the pandemic that happened as well. Whether those prisoners went on, how many of them went on to commit murder, I think is not something that is known. And it may not be a major driver of what happened either, but that's another factor. Certainly, like you talked about, the police pullback. Although, if I remember correctly, the murder rate increased, like you mentioned, in places that weren't directly affected by protests or police resignations, and even happened in rural areas as well. It wasn't just city areas that saw this increase. So that sort of I'm sure that played a role, but probably not the only role, right? And the same thing with firearm sales, right? During that period of time that we talked about earlier, where we had this sustained low murder rate, we also saw a lot of increase in firearm sales during that period. And then also, during the beginning of the pandemic, the beginning of the pandemic, huge spike in sales. The rioting saw another huge spike in sales. But while that meant there were a lot more people who own guns than before, probably a lot of new gun owners in that pool, the reason we know there was a spike in sales, right, is not because there's a national registry that tells you who all owns guns or how many are sold every year is because of background checks, right?
Right.
We count the background checks as an analog for gun sales, which means that the people who bought those guns could pass a background check. And I think it's unlikely that they were, that a substantial number of those people are who drove the spike. And even with that bit, because I remember reading actually that piece at the time, and it is interesting, but I think Robert Verbruggen, who we've had on the podcast before, over at NRO, wrote a response to that piece that I thought made more sense to me because, now I will say there was a slight increase in the number of guns that were recently sold showing up in ATF trace numbers, because most trace guns, most crime guns are 8 to 10 years old, right? The average I think is 8.9. It came down a little bit during the pandemic, so there probably was some amount of firearms being bought, an increase in the number of guns that were recently bought going and showing up at crime scenes. The trace data isn't specific to murders, but there's still probably gives you a little bit of a correlation there. But I will say, like, it probably had more to do with because people being stopped by the police and having guns found on them are, depending on what city you're in and the laws there, they're probably not people who could legally own guns anyway. And so what you probably saw was an increase in both your sort of law-abiding people wanting to buy guns because of all the chaos going on. And then also, criminals, frankly, their motivations for wanting guns and carrying guns are very similar to everyone else, right? Which is that they want to protect themselves. Now, a criminal carrying a gun on the street is probably trying to protect themselves from somebody else who's probably not allowed to legally have a gun on the street either. And it's probably saw an increase in both of those groups having guns on them, if that makes any sense. I mean, obviously it's not like criminal and non-criminal and people stay those roles forever. It's not that black and white, obviously, but I think generally speaking, Verbruggen's theory was both that non-criminals were buying guns for protection, and then also criminals tended to carry guns more often is perhaps what was going on. And that is part of what led to this increase in fatal shootings, involved in street crime.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would make a distinction there for my purposes. I think that you sort of mentioned the ATF data. It wasn't just a small increase. It went from in about 25 to 30% of traced firearms being within 2 years of purchase to almost half in 2021. So I guess
I mean by small increase is just I don't. You're right. I don't want to mislead anyone. What I mean is like the overall number of the guns
most
they
guns
traced
are not
is a
being
relatively
found
small
in a crime.
number.
Yeah, you're absolutely right on that. And I think that the important thing to sort of keep in mind when looking at murder is that murder makes up 0.2% of all major crimes that are reported to the FBI each year. So it doesn't take a lot of incidents of, hey, you and I get into a fight in 2019 and neither of us are carrying a gun. 2021, we get into a fight and both of us are carrying guns and it leads to a fatal incident that wouldn't have earlier occurred. You get a couple of hundred or a couple of thousand of those incidents and you have a big change in the number of murders. So it doesn't take a lot for such a low base rate crime to see a large percentage change.
Yeah, and I do think that the basic theory that police were maybe not necessarily getting better at finding guns during traffic stops or whatever, and that were just more people carrying guns is probably true. It's just connecting that to the increase in people who can pass a background check buying a gun. That's where I think there's less of a direct connection is all. So I don't know that we're very far apart on this point, but that's my main critique for what I would say.
And it circles back to, if we had better data, we could point to, okay, we're also seeing this increase in stolen firearms, or there's a correlation between places that are having, increased stolen firearms with increased shootings. But because we don't have enough good, NIBRS could actually produce that data, but it's not produced at a level that allows us to do that. So we're SOL on that one.